I'm Ed Staffman. I am the representative from House District 62, which is beautiful downtown and the historic district of Bozeman, backing up to the Gallatin Mountains, a very beautiful area which, if you haven't been there, I would hope you'll come visit someday. So this bill, House Bill 387, I sort of stumbled upon the problem in looking for something else. I came to realize that there are a couple of small power plant producers known as Kelp and Yelp. Kelp is in Colstrip and Yelp is in Billings. Kelp burns coal waste, and Yelp burns petcoke or petroleum waste. And I came to realize, after speaking with the folks at the Public Service Commission, that the cost of power that's paid for this power is roughly $111 an hour, a megawatt hour, excuse me. And I know enough about power to know that roughly the new bids that come into Northwest Energy for power are in the $45 range, sometime less, and so I got curious as to why this is so expensive. And so I dug down on it, and what I discovered is that there are three pots of money that are used to pay this $111 an hour. And if you have I passed around a fact sheet, and I'm going to go over that. It's just a page and a little bit more. So these contracts, the contract on Kelp lasts for another 3.5 years. All the numbers I'm going to give you today are from January 1st, 2021. So obviously every day the numbers change slightly, but that's the numbers I've been working with. So that contract has another 3.5 years on it, and the one at Yelp has about 7.5 years on it. And so computing the cost over the remainder of the contracts, we find out that the ratepayers of Northwestern Energy, so these plants sell their power to Northwestern Energy, who then uses it to distribute to ratepayers. And the ratepayers have two fees associated with this. The first is built into their base, and it comes to $45.86 an hour based on the PSC data. And over the course of the contracts will be $213 million until the contracts end. In addition, ratepayers are charged a special fee called a CTCQF assessment, and that's also on their bills, and that's an additional $43.73 an hour. But it turns out that even though the ratepayers are paying those two fees, roughly almost $90 an hour, that's not enough to pay the contract price. And so Northwest Energy actually kicks in another $22 an hour in order to make this happen. And they're carrying a liability on their books of about $103 million as of the first of this year. So the total cost over the remainder of the contracts is about $520.9 million. And I wondered, why is that, and is there some way we can save money if we're paying $111 an hour and we know that power costs $45 an hour? What's wrong with this picture, and how can we save the ratepayers money? And what I discovered is that CTCQF fee is there as the result of the bankruptcy of Montana Power years ago and a bunch of lawsuits that I don't fully understand. But all I know about it is that every year, as a result of those lawsuits and a PSC order on it, there has to be $25,566,513 paid, which gets divided up among the taxpayers, the ratepayers, excuse me, to pay this fee. And so what my bill does is essentially refinances that, because that was computed back at a time when we were in a very different environment and a different economy, and much like you would want to refinance your house if you had a high interest rate, I looked at how can we refinance that to save ratepayers money. And that led me to this bill. So the bill is long, but the fact is there's only 3 changes to law in this bill. There's only 3 parts. And the reason it's long is because when you amend a statute, you got to print out the entire statute. But let's look at the salient parts. So part 1 is an amendment to section, to chapter 69 of the Montana Code, and you'll find the change on the bottom of page 5. Everything prior to that is just a printing out of what's already there. And all it does is give Northwestern Energy the power to purchase these contracts, to buy them out for their fair market value. They don't have to do it. There's nothing in this bill that will require them to do a single thing, nothing in the bill that will require these 2 plants to do a single thing. But if they choose to do so, Northwestern Energy can negotiate with these plants, and if they can reach a price to buy out the contracts, they present that to the PSC in order to go to the next step. So that's a very important point, is that nobody's required to do a thing under this bill in Section 1 in the first part. Part 2 you'll find on page 7 of the bill, and this says what happens next in the event that the Northwestern Energy is able to negotiate a price for this. And there's just a few provisions here, and it basically says that the cost savings that would come as a result of this will be shared by the ratepayers and Northwestern Energy in proportion to the current liabilities. So if you look at the numbers I gave you earlier, right now Northwestern Energy pays about 20% of the bill, and so they would receive about 20% of the cost payments. I'm using round numbers here for simplicity, but that would be calculated precisely by the PSC. So that's the first part. The second part is once this was presented to the PSC, it gives Northwestern Energy 2 years to do it. And the reason for that limit is because as time goes on, these fees are accumulating further and further, and the benefit starts to decrease. So we want to make it happen as quickly as possible. The next provision in there is that it must save the ratepayers at least 6%. And the reason for that is because sometimes when the PSC does these deals, there's some assumptions in there, and the assumptions don't always turn out to be exactly right, and we want to make sure there's enough room in there so that the ratepayers will save money. If somebody wants to make that a little different, it's your bill, and that's fine. And then the other provision in the second part of the bill is that the utility commit to use generation from renewable resources to replace these resources. And that brings me to the third part of the bill, which you can go all the way down to page 21 before you see any new code. And it's a new section, Section 5 of the bill. And this sets a carbon intensity limit on small power plants. So carbon intensity is the amount of carbon that's put out for the megawatt hours produced. So the limit that we've set is 1.2 metric tons of carbon per megawatt hour. The only 2 plants in this category that produce that in this state happen to be those 2. Just for purposes of reference, Colstrip it produces 1 to 1.1, the main coal plant. So this is far more carbon producing than coal plant than Colstrip. And I want to say I discovered only in the last couple of days that there are a couple of what I call micro plants that burn wood chips that may run afoul of this, and they contacted me and I said I'm happy to include an amendment that takes care of their concern. Because that has nothing to do with the rates, which are the main the rates at Culp and Yelp, which are the main focus of this bill. So the effect of the carbon limit is twofold. One is it's an environmental measure for reasons that you all are well familiar. But the second is there's a grandfather clause here. So they could continue to, Kelp and Yelp can continue to operate through the end of their contracts. There's nothing in here that prevents that. But at the end of their contracts, with this 35-year-old technology and old power that's polluting our great state, they would not be able to operate anymore. And the impact of that is not only an environmental impact, but it also makes the buyout more feasible, because we all know what we're dealing with: 3.5 years of profit on one, 7.5 years of profit on the other, and we know it comes to an end at that point. So that's an important provision, because we need that in order to make the buyout. Well, we don't 100% need it, but it will make the buyout a lot more likely. So what happens if this buyout actually happens? So I worked with Northwestern Energy to take a stab at what the buyout price might be for each of these contracts. Essentially, what you're looking at is the fair market value of the contract. How do you measure that? The profits that they would make from now until the end of their contracts. And we don't know, we don't have access to their books, but we are able to make a rough guesstimate. And so what I'm going to tell you is based on the rough guesstimate that we made. Remember, if the guesstimate is way off, Northwestern Energy doesn't have to pursue this, and they don't have to sell. So there's no downside in this. So, but by the guesstimates that we made, the $45 that are being paid to the ratepayer would essentially be the same cost for other power, because that's roughly the cost of power. But so Northwestern Energy, once they purchase these contracts, would take it to the PSC and they would bond it. And based on the contract, on the buyout costs as we calculated, and adding in bonding fees and so on, the estimation is about $103 million that would then be picked up by the ratepayers in lieu of the $203 million that is currently the CTC fee. So there's about $100 million in savings right there. But in addition, if you'll remember, I told you Northwestern Energy has to kick in $103 million. That goes away because they're no longer getting that power. And so there's $200 million of savings, of which 20%, roughly $40 million, would go to Northwestern Energy, reducing their liability from $100 million to $60 million, and the other $160 million would go to ratepayers, which, by the way, is not only residential ratepayers like me, but also some big businesses that pay this CTC fee as well. And so if you look on the back of my handout, you'll see the actual numbers that, in fact, what now ratepayers are paying $89.59 an hour, and that number is very solid. Based on our speculation as to the buyout cost, they would be paying $53.82. And Northwestern Energy, which is now kicking in $22.08 an hour, would be kicking in $13.26 an hour. And the bonus for all of this is that these two plants, which produce a little less than 10% of Northwestern Energy's power, produce 35% of its carbon. That's how, and partly because this is a technology that's 35 years old. And so it's time to move into the 21st century, and more important, it's time to save our ratepayers a ton of money. I don't think there's a single tax break that this body, the legislature, can give to Montana taxpayers that will amount to the kind of money that ratepayers stand to save from this bill if Northwestern Energy is able to implement it. So with that, I'll sit, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for your attention, and I'll listen for the witnesses.